Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you all for taking the time this morning to attend this webinar. Just before we get started, what I'd like to do is to confirm that all of the presentations from this morning's speakers will be made available after the webinar, so there's no need to furiously take notes or make questions aside for later on that score. So we are recording it as well, and the recording will be made available to you as well. So what I'd like to do now is to just sort of give you, David, in here, something's happened. Sorry, I'm just, looks like I'm struggling. David. Okay, good. Okay, here we go. So, yeah. Okay, so the question then really, I mean, the main question for this webinar is, is a particular product a food? Is it a medicine? Is it a food for special medical purposes? Is it a sports supplement? And so caught up in some of the recent changes there. And, the reason for, I guess, asking these questions is that that interface between foods and therapeutic goods is complex, and if you get it wrong, there are some very serious consequences. So what we're going to be doing is hearing from a range of industry stakeholders, and also hearing from the Food Agency and also the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Now, I'm struggling here. What's up, Dave? I think. Okay, so who are we going to hear from today? So myself, Stephen Scarf, the Regulatory and Legal Director here at CHP Australia. I'll be giving you a medicines perspective, and then we'll hear from Anne-Marie McIntosh to give you from the AFGC to give you a food perspective, Marit Anderson from the AANA to give you the advertiser's perspective, and then Angela Davies and Emma Breen from FSANZ to give you that agency's perspective on the interface, and then Dr. Adam Cook and Madeline Garraway from the TGA to give you the therapeutic goods regulator's perspective. And following the presentations, we'll have an open session for question and answer. So what we'll do is during the course of the presentations, if you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to send through the questions, we'll let them build up during the presentations and answer them in the session, the time we've allowed at the end of the presentations. So let me get started. David, I still can't control. Okay. Yes, good. Okay, so a little bit about CHP Australia to start with. So we're an industry association with a diverse range of members. So we've got sponsors of OTC medicines, sponsors of complementary medicines, sponsors of other consumer healthcare products, manufacturers, and then a range of organisations who provide support to the industry. We reckon that our membership represents about 70 to 80% of the $8 billion consumer healthcare market. And on behalf of members, we provide advice, support, advocacy work, and representation. And what I've got here is a list of the ordinary members. So these are members who have products in the market. Their names are on the packs. A lot of those will be familiar to you. We've got large multinationals, smaller local companies, a range of views, which I think makes us a stronger organisation for having that range of perspectives. And then a full list of the membership here. So the ordinary members and then the associate members who are those organisations who provide support to the industry. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll launch into my presentation, and we'll just go through sort of exploring our members' perspective on this particular issue and what we see from the Secretariat. So to start off, what is a therapeutic good? Well, it's defined in the Act, and it's anything that represents itself to be, or that may be taken to be, for a therapeutic use. And so then you need to look at, what is a therapeutic use? And that's also defined in the Act. And it's about, preventing, diagnosing, curing, alleviating diseases, modifying physiological processes, testing people's susceptibility to disease, testing for pregnancy, and then the replacement of body parts. So really, from a medicine's point of view, it's those first two bullet points here. So is it relieving symptoms? Is it, curing disease? Is it influencing physiological processes to some extent? So they're really those 2 points are the of main relevance here today. So let's sort of thinking about things that are medicines and things that are obviously medicines, analgesic tablets, for instance, cough and cold liquids, multivitamin capsules. Those things are obviously medicines. And if you've got a product that's a medicine, you need to be familiar with a whole range of aspects from the therapeutic goods regulatory framework. You need to be aware of the scheduling of all of the ingredients that are in your product through the SUSMP, the poison standard. You need to be aware of the different pathways for getting therapeutic goods to market, either as a registered medicine, a listed medicine, or a listed assessed medicine. Those three broad pathways that are available, each with their own processes, guidelines, costs, different obligations there. Then there's the public register of those goods, the ARTG, the various requirements in the Therapeutic Goods Act and the regulations, the therapeutic goods orders, which are published by the TGA on a range of topics. Notably there, the labelling order, TGO 92, which is at the end of a 4-year transition period at the moment, and that's got comprehensive requirements in terms of therapeutic goods labelling. There's also specific advertising requirements in the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code, associated guidelines that go along with that, and the processes that are attendant on that as well, to do with the use of restricted representations, for instance, the use of specific sorts of claims, some of the complications around testimonials and endorsements, for example. And then one of the other things I think you need to bear in mind is anything that's recently changed, anything that's in the process of changing, or anything that might be on the horizon. So if you're developing a product, for instance, it's very useful to know that, know whether the particular ingredient, active ingredient that you're looking at might be the subject of some sort of impending review or a review that's just started, because the last thing you want to do is develop a product with a particular active that the TGA has taken an interest in and then subsequently introduces some restrictions on that as a result of safety concerns. And in the meantime, you've developed that product, you've manufactured development batches, stability batches, you've invested a lot of time in that. So it's not just what's there now in terms of requirements, but what's on the horizon and what's in the short and the medium term horizon as well. It's very important to be familiar with all of those things. So the flip side of the coin, I guess, is for foods. And there's a range of things here that are obviously foods. And there's not a problem if something's obviously a medicine or obviously a food. It's where it's a little bit ambiguous. So I'm not going to be talking about the regulatory requirements for foods, the obligations. Anne-Marie will be covering that off, as well as Angela. So what we'll do now is, look at that decision that's in front of you. If you've got a product or an ingredient, or you want to make a claim, or you want to change a product, which path does it have to go down? Is it a food? Is it a medicine? Is it something else entirely? How do you decide? How do you work out? And I think sometimes the decision's fairly clear. Sometimes it's less clear, and that's what I've tried to do here with these images. Is sort of show sometimes it's obvious which path to take, and sometimes it's less clear. So this is the interface that we're talking about, the food medicine interface, where it's not strictly clear one way or the other. And there are some tools that can be used to make things clearer. So the Section 7 declaration mechanisms, and I'll talk about that a little bit on the following slide. But I think the important thing here is that if you're a manufacturer, an importer, a supplier, an advertiser of a product, you need to know which category it fits in, because there are different requirements and there are consequences for getting it wrong. So if you've got something that's more correctly a food and you're treating it like a therapeutic good, then you're exposing yourself to risk there, and also perhaps unnecessary regulation. And if you've got something that's a therapeutic good and you're marketing it as a food, then you're outside of the TGA's requirements when you actually should be complying with them. So there are some important considerations and some serious consequences. So just quickly to look at some of the the Section 7 declarations. So there is a recent declaration regarding sports supplements, and I think Madeline and Adam will be touching on that during their presentation. There is a 2019 compilation, and that compilation really has sort of three sections, three active sections. So things that are declared to be therapeutic goods, and some examples there are fiber products that are in the form of a tablet, for instance. So they're definitely therapeutic goods. And then there's things that are therapeutic goods when they're used or marketed or presented in a particular way. And so the example there is around folate substances, and when they're presented as preventing, curing, or alleviating depression, for instance. And then there's a section, things that are definitely not therapeutic goods when you do something. And the example there is the unmedicated dental chewing gum. So that, those Section 7 declarations are helpful in navigating that interface as well. And then there's also the 7AA declarations, where therapeutic goods are excluded from the operation of the Therapeutic Goods Act. And there's a recent excluded goods order to do with hand sanitizers, obviously as a result of the COVID pandemic. So even with all of those things, it's still very complicated, and members are regularly contacting us. They've got a new claim or a new product or a new ingredient, or they're thinking of modifying an existing product, and they want to explore what the implications of that are. Is it going to push a food into the therapeutic space? Is it going to take the therapeutic goods into the food space? Can it be manipulated in a particular way? If they do want to market it as a food, or if they do want to market it as a therapeutic good, are there things they can do with the ingredients or the claims that could sort of tend towards one of those paths? So sometimes members are wanting to work towards a specific outcome. Sometimes members are just wanting some clarity. So the sorts of things that we get, we've had recent discussions on with members are gummy products, probiotics, overseas products, and, given the different regulatory environments in other countries and Australia, the categorization or the regulatory oversight of a particular product in another market is not necessarily the same as will apply here in Australia. And then, like I said, you've got a new product, or you want to adapt something, and you've got existing claims or new claims, and once again, new ingredients. And, if there is an ingredient that's sort of, becoming quite popular overseas, it's being regulated in a particular way, and you want to bring it into the market here, you can sometimes run into problems with the data requirements, especially if it ends up being a therapeutic good here and it's not one overseas. So there's sort of things to bear in mind when you're looking at it towards a particular outcome. And one of those things is, if it does end up being a therapeutic good here, are you going to have sufficient evidence to satisfy the regulatory requirements? And then there are some recent changes, clarifications that have been initiated by the TGA or by other regulators, and that's the caffeine, the sports supplement and folate, which I mentioned earlier as part of the Section 7 declaration. So the, I guess, movement or evolution in this area can come about because of sponsors, manufacturers introducing new products, or they can come about through action by the regulator. So what happens if you do make the wrong decision, if you end up putting your product into the wrong category, if you assign the wrong category to it? Well, this is not the comprehensive list. This is really the sort of the top several things to bear in mind. You know, if it's incorrectly classified, then you may not have appropriate GMP credentials for your manufacturing site, for instance, or you may not have suitable sources or specifications for your ingredients. The question is, should it be on the ARTG? Is it on the ARTG when it shouldn't be, or is it not included on the ARTG when it should? Have you got the right labelling requirements? As I mentioned before, there is a specific order for therapeutic goods labelling, country of origin claims, and there's reforms ongoing for complementary medicines, country of origin claims on the label, and the difference between food country of origin claims and medicine country of origin claims are slightly different. The differences in advertising claims and compliance, and then pharmacovigilance, product safety obligations are different depending on those two different categories, as are the recall obligations. And just to make it even more complicated, if your product ends up being a listed therapeutic good, then you list the product on the ARTG, you develop the indications and the claims and the labelling without input from the TGA. So that's the way the listing process works. You develop it, you list it, you put a product on the market. You may be subject to review post-marketing, but there's no facility for pre-market review. So you take on that responsibility yourself as the sponsor or as the manufacturer if you're a third-party contractor. And so that adds an extra element or an extra dimension to the complications. So just worth bearing that in mind as well. So that's it for me, the sort of quick run through the obligations for medicines. So what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Anne-Marie to take you through the requirements in relation to foods.
Thank you, Steve. I'm just going to see if I can forward my, yes. Great. Thanks again. My name is Anne-Marie McIntosh and I'm the Policy Manager for Nutrition and Regulation at the Australian Food and Grocery Council. And today I'll be discussing the food medicine interface from the food industry perspective and touch on claims, regulations, challenges, and then I have a wish as well at the end. So I'd like to begin by introducing the Australian Food and Grocery Council. It's a national organisation representing Australia's food, drink and grocery manufacturing industry. Its members comprises over 200 companies, subsidiaries and associates, and these constitute around 80% of the gross dollar value of the processed food, beverage and grocery product sectors. In the therapeutic goods space, we represent members who manufacture over-the-counter medications, disinfectants and tampons, complementary medicines and oral hygiene products. For those who work in the food industry, we know that bringing a product to market is an enormous, timely and costly task, and the retail success of product is critical in this competitive FMCG environment. And so marketers are therefore very keen to leverage potential claims. And there are a number of claims that can be made, such as ingredient content claims, nutrient claims, health claims, and origin claims. And with all these requirements, with all these claims, there are requirements. So we have the FSANZ Food Standards Code that applies to nutrient and health claims, with additional nutrient profiling scoring criteria applied if making health claims. of which there are over 200 pre-approved general level health claims and 13 pre-approved high-level health claims. We have the Australian Consumer Law, which prohibits false, misleading or deceptive representation. We have the standard for country of origin labelling, and we have the Therapeutic Goods Act, which applies if a food product is making a claim that is therapeutic in nature, as Steve discussed. And under the FSANZ code, food products cannot make therapeutic claims. Therapeutic goods, as Steve has outlined, are broadly products for human use that prevent, diagnose, cure, or alleviate a disease, ailment, defect, or injury, or, which is important, influence, inhibit, or modify a physiological response. A health claim is one that implies the health effect on the human body, including a physiological process or outcome. And it's regulated under Standard 1.2.7, Schedule 4, and it's quite a broad definition. Where it becomes fuzzy is at that interface between the two regulatory systems, such as when some health claims on foods appear like therapeutic claims. So, for instance, how would these claims be categorised? Would they be health or would they be therapeutic? So lowering cholesterol, that influences the physiological process. Eases digestive comfort, is that also alleviation? Reduces your risk of osteoporosis as opposed to prevents osteoporosis. The term restores, is that the same as alleviates? And what about the term remedy? Is that synonymous with cure? Therefore, a claim and the format may technically stop it from being a food and move it into a therapeutic good. So the challenges that industry faces with claims at this interface are compliance by the industry and enforcement by regulators. The Health Claims Standard 1.2.7 is complex to interpret and comply with. I get many questions about it, which in turn is difficult to enforce, especially the claims area around health. Interpretations of how food standards apply are varied, leading to a lack of consistency and duplication of effort. As a result, many small businesses struggle to understand what they must do to meet their regulatory requirements. And the differences in interpretation is an issue for businesses, small, medium and large, particularly those that trade across state and territory borders and therefore across the jurisdictions in which they operate. Health claims may be pre-approved or self-substantiated and can be made beyond the label on websites and brochures, and this further complicates it. I mean, certainly there are resources available which are excellent by FSANZ and MPI for businesses to better understand how to make and substantiate a health claim. However, the guidance materials are often complex for those that don't know the area, or they're too generic for food businesses who do know the area. Oh, great. Sorry, I just had a problem there. The food industry is keen to leverage new claims on products, as I've said, but there are a limited number of claims that are pre-approved. Although a self-substantiation pathway exists for general health claims, if it's not in Schedule 4, you have to do that. And it's costly and often prohibitive for companies to make an application to change the Food Standards Code. And FSANZ has not expanded the pre-approved claims since the standard was developed. The absence of a claim in Schedule 4 does not mean it's a therapeutic claim automatically, as some people think. It may mean that the claim just requires self-substantiation. For those interested, the Implementation Subcommittee for Food Regulation, ISFA, conducted a survey in 2017 on claims in the market and found that no high-level health claim or therapeutic claims were made. There was a high level of compliance with the standard, and that most of the claims that were made were nutrient content claims, but of those that were general level health claims, half complied and half didn't. And the reason why they didn't comply is mainly due to that food health relationship. It was either not approved or it wasn't self-substantiated. As previously mentioned, while the food industry does look for guidance, it is difficult. Oh, sorry, I've missed a. Thank you. As previously mentioned, while the industry does look for guidance, it is difficult to obtain and understand given the multiple enforcement agencies involved in this space. Getting Your Claims Right, which is a great tool, does provide information and does call out that a food cannot be represented in a way to be taken for therapeutic use due to its presentation or for any other reasons. However, that is generic in nature, and the detail that the industry seeks guidance on is not there. And this is a tool that, I'll come to that in a moment. When the AGC receives queries from members, we advise that food companies, before they make a health claim, they must ensure it's a food. I mean, this seems obvious, but the product presentation or format is important. As Steve mentioned before, if it's a tablet, capsule or pill and making a claim that may be viewed as therapeutic, it's likely to be regulated as a therapeutic good. A good example is a special purpose food such as sports foods and sports supplements, which is a 7S declaration. TGA can decide that a food is a therapeutic good called a Section 7 declaration, such that products otherwise regulated as a food are regulated as a therapeutic good. The TGA has a great tool, which I'm sure will be mentioned later, to help businesses determine if they have a food or a therapeutic good. Understandably, the food industry is cautious as the interface is grey, the regulatory burden is great, and there is potential for breaches if a food is determined to be a therapeutic good. In the case below, it is permissible to make a general health claim on protein according to Schedule 4, but would the use of the image of a bicep be considered a therapeutic claim or not? Industry is seeking greater alignment to ensure consistency in approach, given examples involving caffeine added to the poison standard, as Steve mentioned, sports supplements, and allergens in relation to precautionary labelling. It is important for recognition by the industry and regulators of the potential misalignment and to limit the ability for the system to be gained on either side of the divide, so there are no unintended commercial advantages. Additionally, the levels of claim substantiations on either side of the interface should be proportionate to the risk to health. One mechanism to achieve this is the establishment of a committee that meets regularly to arbitrate and provides guidance on these unclear cases before they go to market, somewhat similar to the FSANZ Advisory Committee on Novel Foods. So in summary, the industry faces challenges at that fuzzy interface with food and medicine. It seeks further guidance to ensure breaches are not made of either regulatory system, which is possible, and would appreciate some transparent mechanism by which to address these unclear cases. Here are my contact details. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Mara Anderson from the AANA.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I will try to start my presentation. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you very much for having this opportunity to talk about our codes. So I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager at AANA, and AANA, oh, there we go, is the peak body for Australian advertisers. We're together with the ad standards, we are the self-regulatory bodies for advertising in Australia and have been operating in this current system since 1997. Ad standards basically receive all the complaints about advertising in Australia, and AANA develops, reviews and updates the advertising codes. So in a typical year, for example, ad standards will receive up to 5,000 complaints and adjudicate over 500 cases of advertising complaints. Just a little bit of a look at our code. So AANA, we have 5 different advertising codes. The cornerstone of all advertising codes is the Code of Ethics. Then we have the Children's Code, the Environmental Claims Code, and the Wagering Code. But today we're going to be talking about the Food and Beverage Code, which fits into this perspective that we're looking at today. The Food and Beverage Code has a definition that excludes alcohol beverages. So food and beverage products means any food or beverage products other than alcoholic beverages, which is covered by the ABAC code, the Australian Beverages Advertising Code. So when it comes to the Food and Beverage Code, the part that is relevant to this discussion is the truth and the truth and honesty perspective, so that an ad must not be misleading or deceptive or contravene prevailing community standards. It must also be communicated in a manner that is appropriate to the level of understanding of the target audience. And also in the same vein, be accurate in its presentation of all information. And it also relates, of course, then to being able to substantiate any nutritional claims or health benefits that you make in an ad. The most used test in our Food and Beverage Code is whether the ad undermined the importance of health or active lifestyles, or that it doesn't promote an excessive consumption. However, the misleading and deceptive provision is also right up there when it comes to receiving complaints about food and beverage ads. So I just want to look at one case study taken from the Ad Standards website that sort of is relevant to what we're talking about today. So the Food and Beverage Code will cover products like this one, which was an Alka Power water. The complaint was about the actual website promoting the product. And this particular ad was found in breach of the first provision in our Food and Beverage Code, which was that it was misleading and deceptive in some of its claims. The ad basically made certain claims, such as that the product had a pH of at least 9, that it deactivates pepsin, detoxes the pancreas, could increase bone density, and it also claimed that sugar is one of the most acidic foods. So a number of these claims were found to be misleading. So what the Ad Standards do in this scenario, normally the community panel will look at all the claims and the whole ad, is in its entirety, and make a decision from a community as a representative of the community. In this particular case, because of the nature of the claims, they received some expert advice that were able to assist them with some of the claims. So, for example, the claim that the product could deactivate pepsin, the expert basically said pepsin is a peptide that is secreted into the stomach in an inactive form. But basically the independent advisor was unable to locate any direct evidence which supported this claim, and therefore found the claim to be potentially misleading. Similar with the claim about the pancreas, that it detoxes the pancreas, and also the bone density claim was found to be misleading to consumer. And when it came to the sugar claim, it said neither sugar nor honey are acidic food as stated on the Alka Power website. So this is just an example of some of the complaints that come to us and can be considered by the Ad Standards community panel and under the AANA Food and Beverage Code. Just to note that the Food and Beverage Code is currently under review, and we are looking at all the different provisions in the code. It also covers children in particular, and some of the things we're exploring is the need to the need to advertise essential foods to children, and we're looking at this idea of essential food versus occasional food. So there's a lot of input from a number of members and stakeholders in the community when it comes to this particular code. So it's going to take us at least 6 months, I think, before we have something ready to present to the community. And should be we think the code should be ready by mid-21. And finally, we assist our members to ensure that they have compliance with the AANA codes, and that's our contact details, right? I'm sorry. I realised the presentation got stuck there. That's our final slide. And thank you so much, everybody. And I'll just hand over to the next person, and that's Angela Davis.
Angela, can I ask you to unmute your microphone?
Apologies, everybody. Can everybody hear me now? Yes, good. Thank you very much. Apologies for that. Thank you, Merit, for handing over, and good morning, everyone. I am from Australia, New Zealand, Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, and we're better known as FSANZ. My role is to lead the work of the Food Safety and Response team at FSANZ. Thank you to CHP Australia for inviting me to speak today. I'm really delighted to be able to tell you about Food Standards Australia New Zealand and our role in the food medicine interface. Sometimes people can be confused about what our role is. So in my talk today, I will provide an overview of where we sit in the broader regulatory system and mention the current FSANZ Act review as well, which is important for the food medicine interface. Okay, so FSANZ is an independent statutory authority. Sorry, I think I've gone too far with my slides here. I'm not sure how to go back. I'm sorry, the slide isn't working too well. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. That's better. I think I should be able to do that now. Yes. So, okay. So FSANZ is an independent statutory agency which was established under the Food Standards Australia New Zealand Act in 1991. We're a part of the Australian Government's health portfolio, and we are an integral part of the joint food regulation system between Australia and New Zealand. A treaty between Australia and New Zealand gives effect to the New Zealand's participation in, and it specifies their role in the system. So we are a small agency. We have around 120 staff that work across 2 offices. One of those offices is in Canberra and one is in Wellington, New Zealand. We're governed by a board of 12 who have specialist knowledge in a broad range of disciplines. Those 12 people are nominated by stakeholder organisations and appointed by the relevant federal Australian minister in consultation with ministers who are responsible for food regulation across Australia and in New Zealand. Our main function is to develop food regulatory measures, commonly referred to as food standards. And these standards are maintained in the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Code, which we refer to as the Code. We also provide information and advice on food and food standards. We conduct surveillance and monitoring, and we coordinate regulatory responses to food recalls, food incidents, and products at the food medicine interface. We're considered as the public face of the food regulation system and are seen as the principal agency responsible for assuring confidence in food by consumers and the food industry. Our single overarching vision is that consumers have a high level of confidence in the safety of food. Okay, so just a little bit about the food regulation system. Food regulation in Australia is a joint responsibility of the Commonwealth and the states and territories. The system is overseen by a forum of ministers who are responsible for food regulations from Australian, state and territory governments and the Australian and New Zealand governments. The forum are responsible for developing food regulation policies. They are the decision makers of the system and can request that FSANZ develop a food standard, and also can request that a draft standard be reviewed, amended or rejected. The food standards are implemented and enforced by government food agencies in the states and territories and local councils, and also by the government agencies in New Zealand through their respective food laws. The Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment enforce these standards also at the border for imported foods. The food agencies also deal with complaints about food and investigate food safety issues. So that's the responsibility of those states and territory food agencies. It's really important to note that while FSANZ administers and provides information about the code and we develop food standards, we are not a regulator and we have no enforcement powers. That means that we have no decision-making power in regard to the food medicine interface as well. We really are a coordination body in that sense. The joint food regulation system aids to reduce food regulated risk, enable informed food choices, enhance the nutritional profile of food, and enable a strong and sustainable food supply. The effectiveness of the system gives consumers confidence that food is safe and healthy. It also facilitates domestic and international trade and contributes to Australia and New Zealand's good export reputation. So a little bit about the actual Food Standards Code and how it's set out. So the code is divided into 4 chapters, as you can see there on the slide. Chapter 1 and 2 apply to both Australia and New Zealand. These chapters include standards for things like food additives, labelling, composition requirements, and foods that need pre-approval, such as food that has been genetically modified. Chapters 3 and 4 apply to Australia only and set food safety requirements for food businesses and primary production and processing requirements for certain agricultural commodities. In New Zealand, these things are governed under their food law and are looked after by the Ministry of Primary Industries. The standards are based on the best available scientific evidence, and we use international best practice for risk analysis to identify and assess food-related risks when setting standards. We consult publicly on all variations to the Food Standards Code, and we often consult directly with stakeholders and experts on more complex changes. So now getting down to the FMI. So as I've mentioned, we are a coordinating agency in this particular issue. So in Australia, products, as we've discussed, that are consumed orally are generally regulated as foods or therapeutic goods. However, the characteristics of some foods and therapeutic goods can sometimes overlap. Because of this, it can sometimes be unclear whether a product fits within the food or the therapeutic goods regulatory framework. We call this a grey area, and it is known as the food medicine interface. Foods at the FMI require an assessment of their formulation, intended use, tradition of use, dosage, claims, presentation, and more to determine how they are regulated. As we play a coordination role in the regulatory response activities at the FMI, we perform really a secretariat role. This is the responsibility of the section that I manage. And in particular, we're responsible for ensuring that there's a timely, consistent and appropriate response to issues presented at the FMI. And the FMI is overseen by what we call a protocol, and that can be found on TGA's website, and I'm sure they will discuss it in their presentation. So the FMI protocol describes the task of FSANZ and includes receiving all notifications of product presentations, disseminating information about product presentations to food agencies, that's the state and territory food agencies, for their input, coordination of communication between participating industries, agencies and the Therapeutic Goods Administration, organising and communicating product assessment outcomes, and other administrative roles such as record keeping and managing documents. There are some important timelines in the food medicine interface process when a product is being assessed. So manufacturers and importers of products may need to know whether products they make or sell are regulated as therapeutic goods or as foods. This is also sometimes really important for consumers as well, because they really want to understand the classification of products that they are using and if they are suitably regulated. So products at the FMI may be triggered due to a consumer complaint. It might be industry who want to know where their product lies. It could be from a government agency who is investigating foods that are on sale, or it could be any other stakeholder. So questions about a product status are raised with the relevant food enforcement agencies in the states and territories, and they initially will investigate the product, look to see if it complies with the food standards, the Food Standards Code. If clarity is needed about the regulatory framework for an identified product, that food enforcement agency will then notify FSANZ, and they'll provide us with all the relevant product details. FSANZ, as the Secretary of the FMI, will circulate that information to the contacts in all food enforcement agencies across Australia, and we share that information with New Zealand as well. All feedback is then forwarded to the TGA, so that's feedback from the food agencies and information about that particular product. And in that feedback, we include a request for assessment of the product by TGA. This request includes timeframes for the product assessment to take place, which is dependent on the level of risk to public health and safety, that's really determined by the identifying agency. So high risk products will be assessed in 5 days, and the lower risk products, the assessment time should really take no more than about 4 weeks. Once the assessment has been undertaken, the TGA will communicate the outcome of their assessment to us, and we will relay that information to all food enforcement agencies. So the TGA, as they will explain, their role is to determine whether the product is a therapeutic good or not. From time to time, there may be concerns or disputes about the outcome of an assessment. In this case, FSANZ would organise a teleconference or video conference with all agencies and resolve these concerns with the agencies. If the product's final determination is that it's likely to be a therapeutic good, it remains the responsibility of TGA. If it is determined not to be a therapeutic good and therefore likely to be a food, it's referred back to the food agencies to determine what action needs to be taken in that case. So actions taken by the food regulator may include things like education of the food business who has put the product on the market in terms of compliance with the Food Standards Code. It may include warnings. It could also include actions such as food recalls to take foods off the market that are non-compliant with the food standards. And that might involve things like media releases, etc., to ensure that consumers know that that product has been removed from the market. Or other regulatory action as well. If a recall occurs, FSANZ does become involved in that because we are the coordinator of food recalls at the request of the food enforcement agencies. The food enforcement agencies will also share any regulatory actions that they undertake with FSANZ so that we can keep that as a record on the FMI. All relevant FMI assessment activities and documentation is maintained within the FSANZ FMI extranet site, which can quickly and easily be accessed by government FMI contacts. And this site is often used to see if a product has already been assessed before and had already been referred to FSANZ. We also use the extranet to provide FMI information to some stakeholders on request. So some of the products that we might see at the FMI, traditionally these have been things like teas, herbs, spices, gummy vitamin products, and goods applying for novel food status regulated under standard 1.5.1 novel foods. More recently, products positioned as special purpose foods, which are regulated by part 2.9 of the code, are increasingly being presented at the interface due to the rapidly developing nature of the product range. This is primarily related to standard 2.9.3 formulated meal replacements and formulated supplementary foods, and standard 2.9.4 formulated supplementary sports foods. Manufacturers and importers must determine whether to position products as a food or a therapeutic good, as we have mentioned, and there is really no one-size-fits-all model. Factors that may determine this include product claims, the composition or presentation, such as if it's in a powder form, if it's a bar or if it's a tablet. Minor changes to one or more of these attributes may result in the product moving from the food space to the therapeutic goods space or vice versa. Some confusion and ambiguity can also arise as the code does permit some foods to carry certain health claims, as Anne-Marie has mentioned, that could simultaneously cause those products to be for therapeutic use under the definition of the Therapeutic Goods Act. In general, goods likely to be taken for the purpose of influencing, inhibiting, or modifying a physiological process in persons are therapeutic goods, unless there is an existing food standard. So work is underway to improve clarity and provide consistency in regulation, including the recent TGA Section 7 declaration, which will be discussed in their presentation, and a review of the Food Standard 2.9.4 formulated supplementary foods, which FSANZ is actually leading. This review will include the development of revised regulations for sports foods to enhance consumer safety and to be appropriate for rapidly changing sports food markets. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I want to give you some information about the FSANZ Act review. So a provision in the FMI protocol states that it should be reviewed biannually. That review is currently overdue because of the work that's been going on around the Section 7 declaration and the supplementary sports foods. The next scheduled review also has been delayed because there is now this review of the FSANZ Act. So just to finish up today, I'll give you a brief overview of this review. So in 2019, the Forum of Ministers Responsible for Food endorsed a plan to reform and modernise the food regulation system so that it meets evolving consumer expectations and advancements in technology. Several small reviews of the system have found that system responsiveness, flexibility and timeliness could be improved. The aim of the reforms is to ensure the food regulation system remains strong, robust and agile into the future. So the Australian Department of Health is undertaking a review as part of the modernisation work. The review will include a comprehensive examination of the effectiveness of the FSANZ Act and the associated operations of FSANZ. And one of the many things that the review will consider is regulatory changes that could improve the operation and effectiveness of the food medicine interface. And further work on the FMI will be progressed separately to this review. So updating the protocol, for example, is separate to that review, but the outcomes of the review and its impact on the FMI and how the FMI is regulated will be determined by the review from the food point of view. Okay, so stakeholders are being invited to submit their views and perspective on any current issues and opportunities regarding the food regulation system. A scoping paper on the FSANZ Act review has been released for public comment and comments are due by the 16th of November. You can find the scoping paper and response to the consultation online on the Australian Government Department of Health Consultation Hub website. If you would like to keep informed on this review, you can also subscribe for updates on the food regulation website. So I'm happy to take questions at the end of the webinar session. However, if you would like further information or have additional questions on FSANZ and our role at the FMI, you can email us and the email address is up on the screen. If you would like to keep informed of our work, you can also join our subscription service, which is found on our website, and more information on how to join on that, as I said, is on the website. So thank you very much for that. I would like to hand over now to Madeline Garraway and Dr. Adam Cook at TGA for their presentation. Thank you.
David, if you could please grant permission to Madeline to control the screen.
Thank you. So my name is Madeline. I am the Food Medicine Interface Assessment Coordinator at the TGA. And as we already know, I'll be discussing how to determine whether your product is a food or a therapeutic good. To start off with, I would love everyone to participate in a poll, which I think David set up. We're looking at beans green tea. Do you think it's a food or a therapeutic good? If we change the presentation of the product, does that change the way that you would vote? So if instead of being a tea bag, it's a tablet that now tells you that it's for thermogenic weight loss, does that change the way that you're thinking about the product? Small adjustments in the way that the product is presented could continue to change the way that it is perceived by consumers. So if we went back to the tea bag, if we went back to the tea bag and made therapeutic claims that could be about weight loss, or it could be about the standardized amount of EGCG, would that then change your opinion again? So as everybody else has really mentioned, it's that fuzzy area in the middle that's the concept of the food medicine interface, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in Australia, our issues are exacerbated a little bit in that international markets have a supplement space, whereas we only have foods and medicines for these products that we consume orally. So there's a little bit more fuzzy or grey area in the middle. It is important to note though that a product can only be one or the other, either a food or a medicine. So why can it be confusing about whether the product is a food or a medicine? So as we've mentioned with the green tea, we have ingredients that are found traditionally in foods that have purported medical properties. There are other things like apple cider vinegar that also fit into this category. In addition to this, the claims can be quite similar. So Anne-Marie covered a little bit on the claims that we see in foods. So we can make nutrition content claims. We could say that the food is high in protein, or we could say that the high protein content in the food contributes to muscle growth. Whereas therapeutic claims are a little bit different because, as has been mentioned, we do have specific legislation defining what a therapeutic good is and what claims can be made. Why does industry need to know the difference and how to clarify what products are? Basically because the regulatory framework is quite different for both, and there are significant consequences for getting it wrong. So there are criminal and civil penalties if you are importing and manufacturing unapproved therapeutic goods. The requirements are different for manufacturing, licensing, labeling, and advertising. So the legislation framework that's in place, as has been mentioned, is the Therapeutic Goods Act. We also have other legislative instruments. By no means is this list exhaustive, and all of our legislation is available online. I would like to mention in particular the poison standards, or the standard for the uniform scheduling of medicines and poisons, because it is particularly relevant to our discussion today, as it's key in understanding where our products might lie. So the poison standard groups everything from agricultural poisons, chemicals, and medicines into groups that are called standards, and the standards specify a substance's availability to consumers and how it must be packaged and labelled and how it can be advertised. In addition to the legislation, I would also like to mention guidelines. I have put up one example, which is the Australian Regulatory Guidelines for Listed Medicines and Registered Complementary Medicines, which is again really relevant to our conversation today, in that a lot of the products that are kind of in this grey fuzzy area probably do fit into the listed medicine space. All right, I know it's been covered before, but the definition of therapeutic goods, as is defined by section 3.1 of the Act, is goods that are represented to be for therapeutic use or likely to be taken for therapeutic use because of the way they're presented or for any other reason, or goods that are in a class, the sole or principal use of which is ordinarily therapeutic use. So this is, I guess, two parts. And the first part is, how does an average consumer or a reasonable person perceive the product when they see it on the shelf? Are they going to look at it and think that it is a therapeutic good? And then the second part of it is, what is the intended purpose of that product? And we've all mentioned therapeutic use a lot. And as Steve mentioned, the parts that are really most relevant to the food medicine interface space are A and B in the legislation, which is preventing, diagnosing, curing, or alleviating disease or ailment or injury, or influencing, inhibiting, or modifying a physiological process. The good news is that the Act has a legislative mechanism to exclude things from the Act that fit under the definition of food. So if a product falls within a food standard, or if it has tradition of use as food in the form in which it is being presented within Australia or New Zealand, then it's not a therapeutic good, and it's a food. So that is still the case, even if those products that fit in a food standard or have tradition of use as food in the form they're presented, even if they're making therapeutic claims, even if they don't perfectly comply with all of the requirements in the food standard, it doesn't make it a therapeutic good. It's a non-compliant food. As has, I think, also been mentioned, we do have the additional tools to help us clarify the status of products. So in 2014, Section 7AA was introduced, which is a ministerial instrument to exclude goods that aren't appropriate to regulate under the Act, like the recent hand sanitizers in the pandemic. We also have Section 9F of the Act, where a product can be removed from the register if it fits into those categories of having tradition of use as food, or if it fits under a food standard. So how can you determine the status of your goods? It has been mentioned that we do have the FMI guidance tool, which was designed in collaboration with the Department of Health, FSANZ, and the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. It takes the user through all of the relevant definitions in the Act and through the legislation to work out where their product is likely to fall. And it's also endorsed by our state and territory regulators. As Angela has mentioned, we are part of a collaborative formal FMI assessment process, which is coordinated by FSANZ, and the state and territory food jurisdictions participate in as well. In the case that a purported food is found to be a non-compliant therapeutic good, that is then followed up by the regulatory compliance section of the TGA, who follow it up with the manufacturer of the goods or the supplier of the goods. And a little more on the guidance tool. So it can be accessed online. It can be used by importers, manufacturers, also consumers. As it has been mentioned, we do have consumers really wanting to make sure that the products they're using are being correctly regulated and are meeting all of the appropriate standards. And I've just got all of the questions that are looked at in the guidance tool up online. I would like to, I guess, reiterate that it is for guidance only, and your understanding of the legislation behind it will influence the way that you're answering questions. And as Steve mentioned at the start, we sometimes have people wanting the answer to be one or the other, which could also influence the way that you're answering questions. So it is really still advisable to seek advice from a regulatory affairs consultant. But we can look at the questions and kind of run through, even if we think back to our example from the start of green tea bags. So is the product for oral use for humans? Yes, it is. Is there a Section 7 declaration that the product's a therapeutic good? No. Is the product covered by a Section 7AA declaration? No. Is the product goods for which there is a standard in the food standard codes? So the answer is yes, because in standard 2.10.4, the miscellaneous standard for other food, it tells us that the definition of tea is the leaves or buds of Camellia sinensis, and that's what is in the green tea. So in that case, the product's not a therapeutic good. But if we were to have gone through the same questions for the tablets, it's no longer the leaves and buds of Camellia sinensis that's been extracted, so it doesn't fit that definition anymore. So the answer would be no. So we'd go down to question 5. Is there a tradition of use of food in that form? The answer would be no. And question 6, it is making claims about modifying physiological processes. It's saying it's thermogenic. So in that case, yes, the product is a therapeutic good. The recent developments in the FMI space have been mentioned already. The Section 7 declaration that clarifies some sports supplements are regulated as therapeutic goods, but meeting a certain criteria. So products that are used, advertised or presented for supply for enhancing or maintaining physical or mental performance in sports, exercise or any other recreational activities, and also fulfill the next set of criteria, which is if they contain any substances in a schedule in the poison standard, if they have added as an ingredient any WADA prohibited substances, if they have added as an ingredient any of the other substances that are specified in that declaration, or any that are in the form of a tablet, pill, or capsule. And I know that the Section 7 declaration is of great interest, so I've popped up a couple of links there that are relevant, but we do have a lot of information available on the TGA website. The declaration comes into effect on the 30th of November this year for spot supplements with any of those ingredients that we mentioned. But for those that are in the form of tablets or capsules, it doesn't come into effect until the 30th of November 2023, provided that they don't have any of the ingredients we mentioned. I know it's also been mentioned that we've had changes made in legislation regarding the inclusion of caffeine in therapeutic goods, which has been upscheduled. So it's now found in a number of different schedules under the poison standard. So we've got it in Schedule 2, pharmacy medicines, Schedule 4, prescription only medicines, and Schedule 6, poison. That being said, it is still permitted to be used in listed medicines, provided that it complies with the therapeutic goods permissible ingredients determinations, which now has a number of new required warnings. So all of those, again, are available on the website, and the rules are all based on what type of product it is, the amount of caffeine, the daily dose, all of those sorts of things are relevant. Sponsors of existing products that have caffeine in them have until the 2nd of March 2021 to get those into compliance, but any new listed medicines are expected to comply immediately. If anybody has any questions, they can submit those through the Q&A. Thank you very much to CHPA for inviting us here today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, Angela, Marit, and Anne-Marie. Adam, are you going to continue with the presentation, or is that's the end of the TGAs? Okay, good. So what I'd like to do, great, we've got plenty of time. So if there are questions from the attendees that you haven't sent through, I'd encourage you to send them through. I'll just go through them now. So, and this may well have been answered, but I'll put this to you, Madeline and Adam. It says, what role does dose form take in helping to determine whether a product is a food or a therapeutic good? So if a sponsor was to market a multivitamin without therapeutic claims, would a chewable soft gel be likely to be seen as more therapeutic than a gummy? So really, you know, yeah, that dosage form, how critical is the dosage form with or without claims?
So as we saw in the definition of therapeutic goods, anything that is likely to be taken for therapeutic use by the consumer because of the way it's presented, which includes the dosage form, is the consumer going to look at that as a capsule and think that it is for therapeutic use? Adam, do you have anything to add?
I guess I would just emphasize that a consumer might not describe it in the terms of being a therapeutic good or knowing what therapeutic use is, but so it's the term itself is and what that means to a consumer. But if their use or perception of that good would fall into that category, that's what's important, even if the average consumer would not necessarily know what the meaning of a therapeutic good is or therapeutic use is.
And just to build on that question as well, so what are the decisions on gummy supplements? Are they considered food in terms of a tradition of use of the goods? Adam, Madeline, probably best for you.
I can just comment on that. Look, we are aware that gummies are a traditional form of foods as confectionery. However, once they start to become fortified with ingredients and the presentation of the good the claims that are being made, the statements about what they contain, if they do cause that good to be presented in a manner that a consumer would take it for therapeutic use, that can cause them to be therapeutic goods despite being in that gummy form. It really depends on the assessment of the individual product, because all of those factors about the presentation of the good, the packaging type, the imagery, the specific types of claims play a role in determining whether what would otherwise be confectionery is tipped over the line to being a therapeutic good or not.
Yeah, so I think as Madeline was saying, it's the whole presentation. It's useful to, if I understand things correctly, it's useful to go through that tool and look at the different aspects, but it's not very useful to focus on one particular attribute, really, whether it's the dosage form or the ingredients, but to look at it as a whole product.
Yeah, and key to appreciate that gummies fortified with vitamins and containing claims around being multivitamins and supporting health are not a traditional use of that type of good.
And this last question so far from the audience, I think once again, probably for the TGA, but maybe also Angela, I might get your position or view on it as well, acknowledging that FSANZ isn't a regulator in that sense. So looking at ads with misleading and deceptive claims in different languages, or maybe even Marit, it might be useful to hear your perspective as well. So advertising that isn't in the English language, designed to target specific communities within Australia and perhaps globally using social media. How is that being monitored and enforced? So.
Yeah, look, we don't, so it's basically a complaints-based system, Steve. So we rely on the public to send complaints into ad standards to be considered. I'm not entirely sure about advertising in different languages, but certainly we only cover advertising that is made by Australian companies in Australia. So there's that perspective, but also I would assume, using experts, they could potentially apply the same principles of having someone translate an ad if there was a complaint about it, an Australian advertiser advertising in a language misleading and deceptive claims. So yes, I don't, I'm sure if I could actually ask ad standards directly and see what they have done with those kind of complaints in the past and find out an answer for that particular question.
Okay, good. Madeline, Adam, from the TGA's perspective?
I can potentially answer that question. We do monitor and act on advertisements in relation to therapeutic goods that are in languages other than English, but we do take a risk-based approach depending on the prevalence of those claims. We do have a combination of monitoring, proactive monitoring, and acting on complaints to the TGA. So in some part, our ability to act on those depends on reports to us. If there are potentially claims out there that are misleading, and we have a complaints mechanism for advertising complaints through the TGA website. But we do take action occasionally. It just depends on the level of the risk and our awareness of the problems.
Okay, good, thanks. And Angela, I appreciate that's not part of your remit, but are you able to provide any insights into how the food regulators approached non-English language advertising?
Thanks, Steve. Unfortunately, no, because the food regulatory system doesn't really cover advertising. We leave that up to other regulators. So the food regulatory system would look at the information that's provided on a food label, but certainly not from an advertising point of view if it's not connected directly to the food. So apologies, no, I can't answer that question.
Okay, okay. So this next question, okay, and maybe for Angela firstly, and then on to the TGA. So is there any consideration to narrowing the definition of therapeutic effect, particularly regarding having a physiological effect? It could be argued that food and water have that effect on the body to some degree. So I guess maybe Angela, in the FSANZ Act review, is there anything being looked at there? But also maybe Madeline, Adam, are there any sort of thoughts or any sort of activity on the horizon to look at the definition of therapeutic effect?
Thanks, Steve. It's not something that we're looking at in the FSANZ Act review, to my knowledge at this stage. And I don't believe that we have any other work at this stage going on about looking at that definition from a food point of view. I might just hand over to Emma Breen, who is my colleague from FSANZ, who is a nutritionist at FSANZ. Emma, are you able to shed any further light on that?
Yeah, so that would definitely fall within TGA scope as to how they defined therapeutic. And then obviously we would apply that within our setting. So I'm not sure if Adam wants to comment further on that or any issues around the Section 7 and how that term's been used there.
Thanks, Emma. Look, nothing's been looked at that I'm aware of from the TGA perspective about changing that definition. It's true that the definition of what is therapeutic use and the therapeutic good is very broad and does essentially capture all foods making health claims. But as Madeline mentioned, anything that does have a tradition of use as a food or it falls under a food standard is carved out from being a therapeutic good. So despite that broad definition, there is that existing mechanism which creates a line in the sand between the two frameworks. And on top of that, we have the mechanism using the authority under Section 7 of the Therapeutic Goods Act, where we are aware that there's a lack of clarity or some uncertainty to specify in an instrument what whether goods are a therapeutic good or specifically not therapeutic good. So we think presently that the use of that authority under the Act is a sufficient mechanism to maintain a clear line there for what should be foods on one side and should be therapeutic goods on the other.
Okay, so a couple of questions sort of linked here. Firstly, how does the TGA and FSANZ work together to manage conflicts between the regulations? For example, the potentially conflicting requirements in the limits for caffeine. So Adam, I might sort of throw to you for that one first, and then maybe Angela or Emma.
Look, I'll just comment that we do work together to manage that interface between the FSANZ Act and the Therapeutic Goods Act and all of the subordinate legislation. So we're in very regular contact about all of these types of matters, including caffeine, and have a really strong relationship there. It's true that there's a bit to manage on both sides to make sure that the frameworks align, particularly when we're seeking to change things at any given time. But that's just through our normal process of engaging with each other and to keep abreast of what changes might be being made, such as to the FSANZ Act or such as with Section 7 declarations and so on. And caffeine is a perfect example of that, where that's been changed in liaison with FSANZ and indeed the jurisdictions.
Okay, and so Angela, do you have anything that you'd like to add? I mean, Adam's fairly comprehensively answered that, but.
Yes, thanks, Steve. And yes, Adam, you have answered that very well. I'd just like to say that TGA and FSANZ as Commonwealth agencies, we're both under the health portfolio, under the health department, and we do work very, very closely together and very well together. As I mentioned in my presentation, there is under the FMI protocol a system where if a decision about a product is difficult, for the regulators, then there is a process where we can get together and talk about it and come up with a joint decision. So that process is there. There is also a process where we can escalate if the agencies cannot make a decision. Then there's a process where we can escalate that further to the Department of Health for discussion. So we do have processes in place, and we do work very closely together as well. Thank you.
Okay, good, thank you. And this one I might pass on to you, Madeline. Where can I find out more about the changes in caffeine regulation?
So on my caffeine slide, there's a few different places that we can find information about that. So I think there was just a TGA website announcement for high to moderate risk changes to permissible ingredients. As I mentioned, there's the permissible ingredients determination, which will give really detailed information on where certain warnings are required. We've got the poison standard to differentiate when caffeine falls under those different standards. And
Okay.
I guess if we're talking from a food perspective, the FSANZ website also has information there.
Okay, good, good. And then a couple of questions, and I might stick with you, Madeline, about the green tea example. So firstly, if tea bags are covered by a food standard and are labelled with a claim for weight loss, are they a non-compliant food? And if so, what happens?
So if they're a
tea bag
filled with Camellia sinensis leaves, they
yes,
fall under that food standard that we mentioned.
okay. And if they've got a weight loss claim?
So that if it's outside of what is permitted for food, it's then a non-compliant food.
Okay.
Which unfortunately, as Angela's mentioned, they're not the enforcers, so I couldn't give you more detail, but it would be those state jurisdictions that are responsible for enforcement that would then take action.
Okay, yeah. So as and would that applies generally to non-compliant foods then, doesn't it? That it's the state and territories
Yes.
who have responsibility for that. Okay, okay, good. So and there's another green tea question here. So some green tea products are registered or are included on the ARTG as listed medicines. But would a powder be considered as an accepted dosage form?
I think that's a complex question. It's not a simple yes, no.
Yes.
And if I can, I will pass that one to Adam.
Look, there's no specific answer, because that's really where the complexity lies in looking at the overall presentation of the good. I suppose it's just relevant to say that there's simultaneously a recognition that powders that are formulated into a liquid and then drunk are recognised as a traditional form of a food, yet we do have powders and drinks that are formulated to be consumed in that manner that are therapeutic goods as well. So it does come down to the ingredients that are contained within the product, the claims that are being made, and the packaging. And that's a case-by-case assessment.
Okay. Okay, and probably sticking with you, Adam and Madeline, where do collagen supplements lie? So tablet formats are usually listed medicines, but many powders and sachet formats are classed as food. So is this a case of the presentation really determining the category?
Well, presentation will always have a role. I suppose the key question to consider in that context is whether collagen as a powder has a tradition of use as a food in Australia and New Zealand for the last 50 to 75 years. I'm not aware that there's a food standard for collagen powders. That might be a factor as well. So just the mere presentation as a powder is not ordinarily sufficient to make it a food. or indeed inclusion of an ingredient in a tea bag is in some circumstances not sufficient to make it a food either. It depends on what the ingredient is in the overall presentation. In the case of green tea, the ingredient that's in the tea bag has a tradition of use as a food, and it's presented in a form, being a tea bag, that's also associated with that tradition of use. So there's a spectrum all the way along. We've probably chosen a couple of extreme examples at either end that make it a bit easier, but you could increase the complexity as you approach that line.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, isn't it? You know, like when I was looking for pictures for my presentation, you know, if you're thinking about things that are obviously medicines, they're easy. Things that are obviously foods, they're pretty easy as well. But it's, yeah, as you go closer to that line and you know, there's less of those attributes in the product that it does become more and more complicated. So that's good. Let's see what else we got. Okay, and maybe Angela, I might pose this one to you. Is there any update on the progress of the FSA HNZ P1024 on nutritive substances and novel foods?
Thanks, Steve. I might actually hand over to Emma to speak to that. Thank you.
So that's referring, for those who don't know, to Fazan's work on clarifying our definitions around what's a nutritive substance and what might make a novel food. So that's P1024. And at the moment, that work is currently on hold as we have competing priorities. And obviously, while we'd love to have our infinite resources to manage everything, we do have to take a risk priority approach. So for now, that's not currently progressing, but it is still very much on our work plan.
Okay, thank you. And Adam, I'm just going to take you back to the collagen supplements question again. So collagen supplements with a cosmetic type of claim ending up in the Section 7 declaration as a therapeutic good, but the ingredient promoted is often an excipient included on the 26BB list. So really sure.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah. So yeah, if it's got a cosmetic claim, but it's got the okay. So if it's also got an ingredient that's on the 26BB list, that the inclusion of that excipient.
Well, I mean, usually the starting point is what type of claim is being made, either expressly or impliedly for the product, and if that falls under the definition of therapeutic use. If the claim is purely cosmetic and not for therapeutic use, then those products would tend to not be captured as a therapeutic good. However, if all of the ingredients that are included in that product, despite the claims and declared on the product, or all those ingredients would convey to a reasonable person that the product is for therapeutic use, and we consider that consumers would take that product for therapeutic use despite the cosmetic claims, then it may still be a therapeutic good. So it's not specifically about an excipient, but you know, if there is a product carrying no claims expressly, but has a list of ingredients that are very clearly intended to promote the good for therapeutic use, and that's how consumers would understand it is to be used, then it may still be a therapeutic good because there are implied representations about therapeutic use.
Yeah, so leaving the claims or avoiding therapeutic claims alone isn't sufficient to bring you back out of that therapeutic goods category. Okay, so maybe once again for Angela and for maybe Madeline, what about a product like potentiated pollen capsules, making claims like increasing energy and boosting immunity? So you've got, you know, the capsule format, you've got the potential traditional use of pollen, and then, you know, whether increasing energy and boosting immunity is sufficiently therapeutic or not.
So I guess, is this in terms of where the product is likely to be categorized?
Yes.
So is there a tradition of use as a food in this form, in a capsule form, in Australia or New Zealand? Or does it fall under a food standard as it is, would be the first question there. Capsule as a form is normally not going to fall into that, I guess, tradition of use. As for food standards, Angela could probably give more insight than I can on that.
I think Emma is probably better to answer that than I am at this stage.
Yeah, and I would probably just echo what Madeline has already mentioned. Essentially, it will come down to that decision of whether bee pollen has a traditional use as a food here in Australia and New Zealand. I think the complexity here is how it is being presented in a capsule form. And I mean, obviously, it's not our decision at this point to make that, but I think you would have a pretty clear discussion around whether bee pollen in a capsule would have a long history of traditional use in Australia and New Zealand. And I think that would give you a bit of an indication as to where you should be presenting that product. But as Madeline said, bee pollen isn't covered in a definite food standard as to how it should be presented and compositional requirements and things like that.
Good. Okay, yeah. So when you're looking at the traditional use of something, you're looking at the substance as well as the form, really, aren't you? So in this case, it's the capsule and the bee pollen. In the previous example, it's the tea bag and the dried leaves. So yeah. Good. Okay. So, and once again, maybe for Madeline and Adam, Appendix A of the Poison Standard has a general exemption for foods. How does that affect the interpretation of whether a substance is in the poison standard, and as a result, the product is a therapeutic good?
So it's just important to emphasize that there is a distinction between something like the Section 7 declaration around sports supplements that specifically invokes the poison standard as a criterion for determining the status of a good, compared to the general situation of assessing the status of a product which doesn't specifically invoke the poison standard, but whether one or more ingredients is included in the product is in a schedule to the poison standard may be a factor, as well as the prominence of those substances. And so we do, think specifically about inclusion in a schedule. So if for any reason, and there are various threshold criteria in the poison standard, that a substance is listed in a schedule but falls below that threshold, then it would be taken to not be included in a schedule. So the mere presence of the name of a substance in a schedule does not mean in all circumstances it is scheduled. One has to look at the full instrument to determine how it operates, and there are thresholds at play, both in the preface to the poison standard and the appendices. So if an ingredient is specifically excluded from being in a schedule by virtue of an appendix, for example, then it would not be considered to be scheduled, and that would play a role if the Section 7 instrument, for example, refers to scheduled substances.
So, and maybe Adam, I might stick with you. If you've got a product called Fat Burner, and it contains food ingredients that comply with the formulated supplementary sports food requirements, will that now be considered as a therapeutic good?
It is going to depend on the presentation of the product. So the Section 7 declaration doesn't pertain to products that are purely for weight loss. However, burning fat and weight loss in the context of the whole presentation of the good could fall within the scope of the Section 7 declaration. So if it would be taken to be for sports people use in recreation, so for example, if it's to lose fat to perform better at a particular sport, if that's the implication, or to to gain more muscle, whatever it may be, then it would fall within the scope of the declaration. So that's the first thing. And sorry, the question disappeared from the Q&A, so I can't see what the rest of it was, but no, that's okay. So that's just the first thing to appreciate. Yeah, I can't see the rest of the question anymore. But
sorry,
just to be very clear that the Section 7 declaration has a very specific scope, and if the product is purely presented for weight loss only, then it's not intended to be captured within that scope.
Okay, yeah. So that was so looking at the name of the product, but it's only containing food ingredients. Would it now be captured? So I think.
Yeah. So just to be aware though that that product may still be a therapeutic good, irrespective of the Section 7 declaration. So just through the normal process of assessing the status of the good, despite containing food ingredients, the question has to be, does it have a tradition of use as a food? Does it comply with a relevant food standard? And so you have to take great care with that. The other thing to be aware of as well is that for the Section 7 declaration, this clarification that we've made, there's no consideration there about whether a food standard applies or not. So that declaration is to be read in itself. If the product is captured by that definition, it doesn't matter or not whether it's compliant with the food standard, 2.9.4, for example.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that there aren't products compliant with 2.9.4 that can remain as foods. There definitely are. It's just that there are a class of some sports supplements which are higher risk, which whether they fall under 2.9.4 or not, they should be regulated as therapeutic goods, and that's what we've clarified in the instrument.
Okay, and just one of the questions there about being targeted towards sports in order to be a food, is that I guess an option or an approach that sponsors or advertisers might take?
I think the question is if it's targeted towards a specific sport. Whether it's targeted towards a specific sport or type of sports person, or more generally, both would be captured by the scope of the declaration.
Okay, good. And now I think there was a question. So for Angela, does the FSANZ record of views on novel foods have any legal status?
I can take that one for you, Angie.
Okay.
Thanks, Emma.
So no, the ACNF is purely an advisory committee. So it has been set up to help applicants who might want something permitted in the code to get some clarity around that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually have legal standing, and there isn't a requirement as FSANZ completes its assessment to potentially agree with or disagree. We can go either way if the assessment determines that. So no legal standing.
Okay. So maybe this might be one for you, Emma, as well, and also the TGA. But what about a food that's presented as a powder or a smoothie blend containing turmeric, which then calls itself an anti-inflammatory food? Is that allowed as a food?
So including turmeric as an ingredient is perfectly fine. I'm sure we would all agree that it definitely has a traditional use of as a food or an ingredient in foods in Australia and New Zealand. The problem there is how it's presenting that claim around the anti-inflammatory factors and properties. And I think then depending on what that looks and feels like, that presentation is likely to probably push it into a therapeutic space based on the claim. So Maddie or Adam might have extra to say.
So, Madeline?
Sorry. So I guess it's quite broad in that, as we've discussed already, presentation is always considered and it's always individual case by case. So it would depend on the presentation, might have other ingredients. What else is in there? Is it just food that happens to be making a claim that they're not permitted to, or is it something that's likely to be a therapeutic good? That would depend on those other factors.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah, and what other ingredients are contained in the smoothie? Does it have other nutritional properties? Is it actually a food smoothie supplemented with turmeric, or is it is the only sort of active ingredient, so to speak, turmeric, and it's just full of filler to aid drinking the good? That those sort of factors play a role.
Okay, so I guess this is one for FSANZ and for the TGA. So looking at, the discussion around the tradition of use as a food in that form, could that lead to a more definitive ruling about the use of capsules and tablets for foods? So, if you're looking at vitamin and mineral supplements in a capsule, could they ever be considered food, regardless of the packaging and the claims that conform with food regulation? So I guess, if I understand that question right, is that dosage form always going to be a problem, or in the future, might it come to have had a traditional use in some form?
Perhaps I can answer that. As we've described, the tradition of use or a food standard are critical factors that we consider, but there are other factors that are taken into account, and that's where the use of the authority under Section 7 or 7AA of the Act can be really valuable, so that if we identify that there are particular types of foods presented in a capsule are appropriate to be regulated as foods for very particular reasons, then if necessary, that can be clarified to make it clear that despite generally tablets, pills and capsules being associated with therapeutic use, there may be a category that should continue to be regulated as food. So I don't think it's quite as black and white, despite there being no tradition of use with those dosage forms and generally being associated with therapeutic goods. The feedback definitely that we've had from stakeholders, in particular during the sports supplements declaration project, was that there are some specific types of products which might be in that form and should continue to be regulated as foods. I don't know, Emma, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, and I suppose just to help the audience is just to give them an example of something like a glucose capsule, how we would still consider that to be a food despite it being presented in a capsule form. So that's, a really clear example of where the black and white doesn't exist in that instance.
Okay, good. And then this is actually the last question here, and I'll open it up to all the presenters. So, and it goes back to, I think, to one of Madeline's early slides about the interface here compared to the interface in other markets. And the question is there any scope in the current framework to create a new class of products, which are dietary supplements similar to those other jurisdictions? And to what extent might that overcome the issues with the food medicine interface?
Look, I can jump in there. I would just say there's definitely scope in that anything almost is possible if Parliament chooses to legislate in a manner that would facilitate having different categories. The reality is at the moment that we have two frameworks established under Commonwealth law, medicines and foods. So something fundamental in terms of a new type of category that's distinct from those would be a decision of Parliament essentially, and definitely beyond the scope of the TGA's remit as the regulator. Notwithstanding the fact that within those broader categories there is risk-based regulation already. So within therapeutic goods and medicines in particular, lower risk products in which many complementary medicines and products that could otherwise be a food tend to be regulated in a low risk category, that is a listed medicine. So there is the ability to take a risk-based approach, and that can balance facilitating market access consumer interest and safety and so forth within the existing frameworks that we have. But yeah, in terms of what's possible, kind of anything's possible, but there are definitely challenges imposed by the legislative frameworks as they currently are.
And I guess, you know, having a third category doesn't necessarily make things simpler either. I think, you know, going back to that Venn diagram of your early slide, Madeline, it just creates another couple of interfaces as well as the one that we had in the first place. So I guess you need to carefully weigh up what benefits might accrue from having that third category, and whether there are benefits that we could obtain. Okay, we do have one more question, and in the interest of finishing early, I might make that one the last one. So is there an option, and this is really, I think, for the TGA, and going back to some of the comments that I had made about listed products, and also maybe some of the comments that Angela made about FSANZ's assessment. So is there an option of seeking a Section 7 or 7AA declaration for a new product in a non-traditional dosage form prior to pre-market supply? So is there a mechanism for a sponsor, advertiser, manufacturer to obtain some certainty prior to the launch of their product?
The short answer is no. The best option is to obtain high quality advice from a regulatory affairs consultant or a lawyer. Having said that, if, you know, we are definitely open to information and feedback from our stakeholders about how the interface operates and whether there are classes of products that potentially fall at the interface and would be captured in appropriate manner. That sort of thing that we're monitoring all the time through our own scanning, through liaison with FSANZ and the jurisdictions, and it can lead to things such as the Section 7 declaration we've had for sports supplements, but that also includes taking on board input from all of our stakeholders generally. So whilst we don't offer the ability to make a declaration as a service to provide clarity, we do monitor sort of feedback in that manner to see if there are you know, classes of goods either current or coming onto the market that we would need to turn our minds to make sure that there's both clarity and that the goods fall on the appropriate side of the line.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, thank you all very much. All of those presentations were really, I found, useful, and certainly great to get the different perspectives. So I'd like to thank each one of the speakers individually for your time this morning and the preparation that went into those presentations, and also like to thank the participants. I've just been keeping an eye on the number of participants, and pretty much where we started is where we finished. So congratulations. It's nearly 2 hours on a webinar, which I think is about the maximum that people can reliably withstand. So thank you all for your patience and the questions too. I was a little bit worried setting up the webinar with so much space for questions at the end, but that was fantastic to get all of those questions coming through. So thanks once again to the speakers and also to all of your participants, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.